Okay, guys. I think we're gonna start. Thank you for coming to the Spinnaker Summit. My name is Jeremy Tatelman. I'm the UX designer on Spinnaker, and with me,
I'm Thielen, and I'm a senior software engineer on the Spinnaker team, and I focus mostly on the UI.
And the focus of this session today is going to be essentially how to maybe address how to look at front-end integration points for when developing with Spinnaker. We're not going to get so much into the back end of this, but sort of along the lines of what Andy talked about in the keynote this morning was this idea of Spinnaker is just sort of the base on which we have the potential to really build a huge delivery platform with a lot of customized integration points. And so this meeting is going to sort of address, we're going to start off talking a little bit about, one, how at Netflix we sort of address these integration points, and then that will grow, we'll get into sort of the nuts and bolts of how we implemented those, and with some examples towards the end, and then questions. Yeah, questions at the end. I think to start, and we will keep this loose. So while there will be questions at the end, I think if there are any sticking points, or if we're going too fast, or we're going, getting a little too detailed, by all means, feel free to raise your hand and tell us to slow down or speed up. So digging into things a little bit, getting started. Why plug into Spinnaker? And I think that, again, Andy covered this really well this morning, but Spinnaker in its base functionality, pipeline orchestration, infrastructure management, is just a place to start with this. Here at Netflix, we've expanded that into a very robust search mechanism. We've supplemented that with things like library management and other things that we'll get into later. But it's just the beginning. And I think that that metaphor of us being at the starting line is a really good way to put this. Plugins are an opportunity to create a seamless, in-context tool for your users. What I mean by this is it's not meant to be the kitchen sink. It's not necessarily meant to be the home of all the functionality that you have in your workflow, but rather where it makes sense. And I think that this is really important to remember, especially in larger organizations. This is, and something we've struggled with internally. I think that keeping the balance between, well, let's just cram it in Spinnaker, and really being thoughtful about what to integrate and what not to integrate.
So I think as we've looked at things that are potentials for plugging into Spinnaker, as we've talked with some teams, in some cases we say, hey, this just doesn't really make sense in this context, and maybe we'll create a link to it or something to that effect. Yeah, as opposed to embedding it directly into Spinnaker.
So really, that process, starting to address what maybe should be plugged in and what not, really starts with us meeting our customers. What I'm going to be talking about here, we refer to our customers as basically other engineers at Netflix, other users here at the company, who may be interacting with our tools, but your customers may be your own team members, or if your product is actually offered to people outside your company, then they'd be very, a traditional customer base. I think one of the most important pieces of this, and where I wanted to start, is it's an opportunity to build partnerships with these people. I think especially for us, when you get into an organization of hundreds and hundreds of engineers, we can't necessarily interact with all of these people all the time, and we don't necessarily know exactly what their needs are. And so when this process begins, it's an opportunity for us to really make, whether or not we end up working together on this integration, it's an opportunity for us to really make that team part of delivery engineering, part of the Spinnaker group. And I think that understanding their use case, truly putting ourselves in their shoes, is a really important part of this process. Understanding their challenges. Again, really understanding what that use case is and looking at things from their perspective is really key for this. It's very difficult to build an integration when you essentially just have a big list of JIRAs and it's like, okay, we'll plug in A, we'll plug in B, we'll plug in C. It's about really understanding what problems they're facing and starting a conversation around how we can sort of resolve those challenges for them.
And I think with the partnership aspect, we can get a list of requirements and build something for somebody. But a lot of times, if you don't have a continued partnership, you might end up going off on a tangent that is not appropriate for that team, that doesn't actually address the issues that they are trying to solve. So having partnerships with our teams allows us to make sure that we are on the right track as we develop these integrations.
And this is really the opportunity where you're going to go through and build out those feature requirements and figure out what their problems are. And one of the interesting parts of this process is that you will reach a compromise. It's not going to be them telling you exactly what they want. It's going to be a matter of, well, in order to be most efficient about this, how do we integrate this into the product that is Spinnaker? How do we create a product-like experience for them? Not necessarily just essentially plug in an app that they already created in their own environment. And then really the last piece of this is, once you've collected all of this information, is determining the depth of the integration point. So to sort of go through that, I've broken this into 4 areas, but I think that in practice, this would be much more granular. These categories are not official, but Mr. Turtle, the Mr. Turtle pool is, I think, my favorite level of integration. Good mix of efficiency and complexity. So the first one, the puddle, this is going to be something contextual, probably read-only information, probably links into either external tools or even other internally facing tools within your team.
Within Deck, we currently, the open source version, in fact, has a spot to add links. So, for instance, adding context around deployed server groups or instances, you can directly link to information that is that instance exposes, and you just add some configuration to your app, and they magically show up in the UI.
And we use this internally. We'll use this with, they're not integrated into Spinnaker proper, but the entire suite of Insight products managed by our Insight engineering team. Atlas, Chronos, and some of those tools, log, sort of log parsing tools, that kind of thing. We will link into those tools. It doesn't make sense for those to integrate into Spinnaker as sort of a first-class citizen. Sort of moving to the next, sort of splashing around in the backyard here. So this would be something that maybe you'd represent via iframes or other sort of windowed or embedded content within of these external views. In Spinnaker, internally, we've done this with analytics. So we maintain a lot of usage analytics around Spinnaker, maintained by our sort of our data engineering groups. And this is an opportunity, without rebuilding those dashboards, rebuilding the visualizations, we're actually embedding in Tableau views. So that's a way for us to surface this information, to use most of the screen real estate for this. You're still in Spinnaker proper, but it's external content directly just sort of embedded in. Diving pool. So this is going to be where you start getting into, and most of the examples we have to show today, I think, are more in this neck of the woods, which is essentially where you have a external backend product or external even UI that you're going to, that you want to develop a UI for and plug into Spinnaker. And in this case, one of the things that this goes through our sort of library management, how we address that, but essentially it's a library outside of Spinnaker proper that we're actually ingesting and bringing in, thinking through the UX. The UX is seamless within Spinnaker. It looks like Spinnaker, but it's actually sort of an external product from our perspective.
And in some cases, these sort of integrations are with products that already exist within, well, in our case, within Netflix, integrating existing maybe applications that used to be standalone, and then we integrate them into the app as a library, as a third-party plugin. Other ones are things that we may have completely developed in-house. An example of that is our the fast properties that Andy mentioned in the keynote this morning. That was a full integration into Spinnaker that the Spinnaker team built independently with a collaboration with the stakeholders, but not necessarily as code contributors.
And I think that actually ties really nicely into the last of these categories, which essentially, at this point, it's not necessarily even a separate integration. This is elements that are brought into the base functionality of Spinnaker. This is where essentially it lives in the Spinnaker code base or very, very close to it. This is basically probably multiple screens in Spinnaker. There'd be no distinction at all that you're working with something that has any ties to an external tool. So moving on, I'm going to sort of nod to Chris here, but we're going to get into sort of the nuts and bolts of how we've integrated.
So as
these points.
As we start thinking about an integration, there's a lot of different things to consider. Each one is completely different. So some things to consider as we start integrating is this a greenfield thing, or are we integrating an existing product that already exists? If it's a greenfield, basically a feature request from somebody, we can start to think about it in the context of Spinnaker primitives within Deck, the UI, and how can we integrate this new feature request? Probably we're building it ourselves. On the other end of that spectrum is when there's an existing application. And if there's an application that already exists, we have to really consider what are the technologies that has been built using, and how do those integrate into the technologies that we've chosen for Spinnaker's UI deck. We also have to consider how much effort is there involved, and how much collaboration will there be with those other stakeholders.
I think, you know, it's for the Spinnaker team, we continue to grow. For delivery engineering, we continue to grow, but we're not obviously growing as fast as the rest of Netflix's engineering organization. And so a lot of these points are meeting with groups, and when you're having these conversations, it's been very important for us to determine how much work, and really meeting in the middle ground to determine how much work I think we're going to have to do and how much work they're going to have to do. And really to get this to scale effectively, I think it really talks back to that partnership.
Absolutely. So some of the existing integration points that we have in Spinnaker today that anybody here can actually plug into. One of those is, and when I say, again, I'm limiting this to the UI. There's a whole nother talk coming, I think tomorrow, that's about more back-end Spinnaker customizations. But this is limiting ourselves to the UI. So one spot that we can currently customize Spinnaker UI is the header. And in the header, we've added some additional items into Netflix's build. Another spot would be the main features, and these are essentially pipelines, clusters, load balancers, security groups, the things that you're already familiar with. Those are built in a pluggable way. So we can add additional main level features that are linked to some sort of an application. Incidentally, those are called data sources. Another integration point is cloud provider overrides. Now, you might say, well, I'm not going to build myself a cloud provider, but you can still use these overrides to customize your own version of Deck. And you don't have to build an entire cloud provider to do that. You can just override certain pieces of the cloud provider that you are already leveraging. One other point would be the application configuration section. Now we allow you to customize this to add additional data, metadata to your application that you can then use with your other. When you build the full integration, you can use the application metadata to drive that integration, and the configuration, instead of being in some file somewhere, it's right here in the UI. So let's talk a little bit about how we at Netflix actually build our custom version of the UI. As you probably know, Netflix is open source, and we have Netflix is open source, Spinnaker is open source, and we have split the code base into a number of different modules. Now, on the Netflix private side of this screen, we see the modules that are specific to Netflix's build And those are the customizations that we've layered on top of the OSS code. So when it comes time to build the Netflix build, we take the public modules, we build those, and we publish those to NPM. So they're freely available via NPM package manager and in the NPM registry. Now, currently, we're only publishing a few of the modules in Spinnaker as NPM packages, and that's strictly based on the need that we've had so far. Netflix pulls in a few specific NPM packages from the modules in deck to build our custom code, but we don't use all of them. However, it would not be difficult to package the other modules into the NPM registry if that's something that your company needs. So at the time where it comes to actually take these packages that we've built and published and create a overall package that Netflix actually deploys and uses, our custom package, we take the Spinnaker packages that we've published, we take our source code that has our customizations, we build our source code, and then finally we take these additional Netflix plugins, which are those integrations that we talked about previously that may have come from another group within Netflix. And finally, we combine them all into our Netflix custom build. And this is what we actually deploy out to AWS. So let's see what we have done here at Netflix in terms of customizing the UI and integrating other applications. Here's a screenshot of the Netflix Spinnaker UI. And you'll see there's a couple things that you might not be familiar with. You can see up in the header, we've got a few extra tabs, help section availability, etc. We've got various other UI elements that are custom to Netflix.
Actually, can we go back to that?
Let's go back.
Yeah. So this is an example. This is actually relatively new Spinnaker functionality. We wanted to. We have a lot of requests from around the organization, not just our organization, but those elsewhere at Netflix, to surface high-level either cautionary notifications or sort of what we call notices in the UI. And this is essentially people wanting to leverage Spinnaker, leverage the eyes that are already being focused on these screens to sort of shout out or alert users to specific criteria that are going on with their application. So in this case, actually, if we go back one more, you can see that up at the top next to load balancers that we have this caution icon. In this case, what we've done here is this is an entry point into this alerts dialog. We have categorized alerts based on, and then they're sorted by criticality. In this case, we just have sort of our base level alert for a janitor monkey, which is how we clean up old infrastructure objects. But in this case, this is a back-end service that we are essentially elevating to the UI in the form of this alert. In this case, Janitor Monkey does and has the potential to remove things that aren't being used, but it's designed to not remove, or rather to remove things that aren't being used, but it does have the potential to remove maybe disabled or things that people have in a holding pattern. And so in this case, we want to show that to the user, in which case they can opt out or prevent that particular ASG from being removed. We also are looking at using this to sort of highlight security vulnerabilities, dependency issues, old builds. I think there's a lot of potential uses for this. We're really excited about it.
So this would be a Mr. Turtle Pool integration here. This one thing that we've added for our customers of Spinnaker is this little help drop down here. And this help drop down is a customization to the header that provides easy access to some of the Netflix specific information, or even not Netflix specific, just Spinnaker documentation. It also provides contact information. This integration has a nice little feature where it'll actually pop up a dialog, and the dialog allows somebody to create a JIRA, an issue, and it gives us the context of the page that they created the issue from, and it's very helpful. Nice, easy way for somebody to enter issues that then the Spinnaker team has visibility into, so we can fix it for them.
I think one of the cool things. Sorry, Chris, I didn't mean to interrupt. One of the cool things about this is that, especially when Spinnaker was new, this was one of the first sections that we actually implemented. I think that when we first rolled out Spinnaker, in order to sort of manage the change of expectations when we moved from Asgard to Spinnaker, really help people. We use this for bugs, we use this for general feedback, we use this for all sorts of things to really open up communication with our user base, even if we couldn't necessarily be in the room with them, and give them an outlet for a lot of the unexpected new features that they weren't quite used to at the time. So really simple, basically just 2 fields and the supporting backend for it, but very, very powerful.
And on that same line, the link to talk to us on Slack, I think, is helpful because it gives us a direct line of communication with our users. So Jeremy talked a bit about Janitor Monkey. I would say Janitor Monkey is a what was the first level of a pool called? It's the very most basic integration.
The puddle.
The puddle. This is a puddle integration. And the thing that I really like about Janitor Monkey integration is that it is extremely useful. It's very helpful to our users to get this information in front of them that, hey, you've got some resources in AWS that are scheduled to be deleted or cleaned up, and you should probably know about that and or do something about it. This integration is a puddle integration because it uses the public APIs that are already available via Spinnaker. There's a these are called entity tags, and there's an entity tag endpoint that you can post information to, and that information is then stored in Front 50, and it's surfaced as these alerts and notifications. Here's another integration that's quite interesting. This integration comes from in what level would this be? This would not be the Abyss. This would be a deeper integration.
The diving pool. The diving pool,
thank you. So
categorization and nomenclature is very important to design.
As Andy mentioned, not all of our users of Spinnaker are deploying to the cloud. And he showed us the very large pipeline that was used by our TV UI people to deploy the JavaScript app to the CDN. This is another example of other people that we're trying to serve using Spinnaker who don't necessarily deploy anything to AWS or any cloud provider. So this is an integration that allows library authors, people who are maintaining libraries here at Netflix, to use Spinnaker for their orchestration and for any sort of behind the scenes, the gears and wheels of publishing a library. They can use Spinnaker for that, but they don't actually have any clusters. So the clusters tab doesn't mean anything to them. However, they do have requirements to understand, how is my library being used? How is my library lifecycle? What is the last time that I've released? And have I deprecated this library? Would I like to deprecate this library? So this integration takes that functionality that comes from a team called Astrid, and it plugs it into Spinnaker. And it plugs it in as a data source, so it shows up as a top-level tab for their application, which is actually a library. It's not really even an application.
One of the, this was an interesting example in that this process, which we began working on with Archana here, sitting in the front row, basically was a very close partnership. Essentially, we went back and forth and had numerous meetings saying, okay, this is great functionality, but where should this live? This is sort of an example of that, one of the first talking point that we had about what's appropriate to put in Spinnaker and what's not. And we had some really good and really challenging conversations around, does this make sense to be in a separate tool? Do people think of Spinnaker for library management? And eventually, as we worked through this concept and we talked through it, we got to a place where we felt like it was an integral part of the process. And I think in line, again, with what Andy was saying this morning, I think that it really ties back to the idea of delivery, not necessarily deployment. So on this screen was actually developed. You can see that based on the new look and feel of Spinnaker, this screen matches and feels like Spinnaker proper, even though it's a new view with new functionality that's being displayed in a new way, but really feels like Spinnaker native, even though it was developed as initially as an external package. And so I think that this is really becoming our case study on how effective it can be to create these sort of really tight integration points in Spinnaker.
And to talk about the partnership, the way that this integration was built was most of the work was done by the Astra team, by Archana, and by the people that work on the back end that create the data that gets plugged into this UI. And the Spinnaker team, we helped with just the integration points, and I think that worked really well. An interesting thing about this sort of integration is that the data that this application fetches doesn't come through Gate. It doesn't come through the normal Spinnaker backend. This actually goes out of band to fetch data directly from the backend that understands this information, because Spinnaker doesn't know about deprecations, for instance.
Question?
Yes.
Can you have other pipelines pushing data into be a library for a different pipeline? Like, do you have that relationship? Is that what maybe some of this library management is? You keep publishing certain pipelines, or is all of the library management something that's coming outside, like you said?
The library management is something that's mostly coming from outside. We have an entire system that's set up to track dependencies and to track deprecations, but that's all outside of Spinnaker's understanding. Does that answer your question?
I think so.
Okay. We can use pipelines to do things like publish versions, and that information will eventually make its way here.
To the libraries.
Yes.
I think another piece of that was looking at, to take that one step further, what does it look like not only to publish the library, but then in a lot of cases, a lot of the library owners want to essentially spin that up, actually on IBM to test it, make sure it's working with a sample app. And so that's another place I think where the pipelines can be extended to help with the library deployment process, delivery process.
Let's take a look at another example. This example is a new view called Timelines View. And Timelines View essentially tracks the changing value of some value. It tracks value changing over time and displays it in a timeline. So the interesting thing about this integration is this started from a desire from the same team that called Cadmium that does our TV UIs. They wanted to be able to see how their deploys to S3, their deploys to the CDN have changed over time. They want to be able to see things like rollbacks, and they want to see that visually. And so another team at Netflix came up with this product that's called 10-foot UI dashboard. And the 10-foot UI dashboard essentially shows them that information, shows the deploys over time in a nice graphical format that is easy to understand. And then there was some talk about, well, Cadmium doesn't have clusters. Is there something that makes sense in place of clusters for some teams that deploy to CDNs? And this is that's where the birth of this integration came from.
Yeah, what you're actually looking at here, so this is sort of, this is an example of what it would look like with ASGs, ASG deployments. But for their use case, what they're actually doing is they're deploying JavaScript packages. And as part of that, they sometimes have multiple packages live simultaneously for different AB groups. They will roll forward and roll back quite a bit. And so for them, and you can actually see this, I think this mock-up has uses a lot of some placeholder date information, but it's not unusual for them to roll to a build and then roll to another build and then roll back and then roll to a new build, a completely different build, all within a couple of days. And so they really, for them, the initial sort of driver for this view was how can we see that very, very quickly and then be able to dive into that information. But you could potentially see this, as Chris said, you could see this information being used for this visualization being used for builds, actual VM deployments. I think it would be really interesting, and I think that we do see it maybe going that way in the future.
Yes.
So, I mean, you talked about rollbacks, and is that represented by that line, for example?
Exactly.
Yeah,
or the first or the top line in that, you can see that they maybe tried that out and they're like, whoa, we gotta bring that back.
It's not good.
Yeah.
And so this, I think this is a really interesting example of the integration and how it changed over the life of that partnership, because originally this was intended only to show deployed versions and rollbacks for our TV UI team. And then as we started getting into it, we realized that there's a lot of opportunity to take this view that they've created and to use it for other things. So we actually hooked it up to our eventing system here at Netflix, which is called Chronos. So we can pretty much anything that is captured as an event in our eventing system, we can display as a timeline. I think that's really, really cool. So,
does that mean that there is a common schema for the eventing, different times?
there is a common schema, and we actually created, but you don't have to follow the schema 100%. Let's see if I can find that slide. So this is a prototype of the configuration for that timeline. And you can see you can pick out certain information from that, from each of the events. And it doesn't have to match up 100% to some specific schema in order to get the advantage. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah.
So a lot of this stuff seems really cool and really enables you to do some really interesting features that don't necessarily come out of the box. My question is, like, where's a good place to start? Because, like, I know you talk about the different layers, like the Mariana Trench versus the and so obviously you'd want to start with one of those lower ones, but how do you recommend kind of diving into this?
The question for the recording, the question was, if I want to start integrating things, what's a good place to start?
I think the first good place to start would be to look at, you're gonna have to create a custom build one way or another in order to do this, customizations to the UI. So I would start with trying to create a custom build of deck that uses the, pulls in the pieces of the open source version that you require. And then from there, I would start going with these integration points. I would start here on the header. And having a custom header is as simple as adding, this happens to be implemented in Angular.js. So customizing this header is as simple as using your own template for the header. There's a bunch of key value pairs in a JavaScript file called overrides. I forget exactly what it's called. But customizing this template, I think, would be a good starting point. And I think it offers some pretty significant wins for things that your company might find useful, like we did with the help section.
Another thing that you can actually see here is, and we don't have a demo of it, but you can actually see in the upper right-hand corner we have this availability block, and that was essentially us surfacing metrics coming out of I don't remember the data source, but essentially one of our data analytics tools around service availability. And we were able to see over time, like, what incidents happened and how that affected availability and that kind of thing. But the visualization is very simple. It's basically just a graph with some supplementary information, as long as we just happen to have the data sources all ready to go. So it was just a matter of figuring out a good way to parse it, and then we elevated it in the UI. Yeah.
How stable is the API, and how much work are we going to have in trying to maintain this against the others with the deck?
The API, as far as these plugin APIs?
Yeah.
I think that's a really good question. It's been fairly stable up until now. Right now, we're in a transitionary period with Deck where we're moving from AngularJS code base to a React code base. And so that's going to be the primary challenge. However, we very highly value backwards compatibility. So I think that we'll be creating an adapter layer that allows either technology to be used as for customization. At least that's my goal. Right now, the customization, it's basically AngularJS templates for the most part. So that, I don't see that going away.
Yeah.
What's the timeline on the switch to React?
What's the timeline on the switch to React?
We are well on our way. We have been coding React components for about 4 or 5 months now, and I think we've bit off a sizable chunk. Most of the UI that we work with on a day-to-day basis is now built using React, and that includes the clusters view, pipelines view, tasks, I believe, is still AngularJS. But most of the things that I visually see on my Spinnaker UI is now React. I think there's going to be a long tail, however. I don't think cutting the I don't think that we'll be able to completely switch to React because of all the different cloud providers out there. Those will still need to be migrated as well, and or we'll create an adapter layer perhaps.
Of the integrations that you've made, what has gotten the most traction or used?
The integrations that we've made, what's gotten the most traction? The small ones, I think, are really, really useful. As an example, so on this screen, we can see one of my favorite integrations, and that would be this little icon here. That icon, when you click that, it copies to your clipboard a command that will SSH into that instance through our we have like this SSH bouncing thing that we do called a bastion. And that will get you right to that instance. I think that's really cool. I think a lot of people like that. I think people like the help icon. I think across our organization, I think fast property integration is probably going to be one of the most highly used things because a lot of teams do use fast properties, and now it's directly in Spinnaker.
I think and also with some of these initiatives, properties is a good example of this. The 10-foot UI timeline that we looked at, library management, library management to a certain extent, I think we have some stuff to figure out there. But for the most part, the expectation is that by integrating these into Spinnaker as sort of first-class citizens, the idea is that people will deprecate the majority of where that came from. And so with the 10-foot UI, the adoption of that, I'm hoping, will be everybody who used the old 10-foot UI. Because if we have to maintain two tools, then that's not really an effective solution. I think the fast properties is another example of that. We have another service, another UI in which people currently maintain and manage their fast properties. It's not very good. So we would definitely like to migrate 100% of the users of that console to Spinnaker.
Are there other partners who contribute to this project? And since it's open source?
Partners that contribute to the UI? Yeah, we get a lot of help from Google primarily and open source contributors, yeah. Mm-hmm.
We also have some custom stages in our pipelines and those are maintained and built by other teams at Deck.
Could you recommend a module that we should look at if we wanted to get started developing into these hooks?
The primary module would be core, and it's deployed to NPM as @spinnaker/core. Let's see. So at Netflix, we care most about, I would say, core and Amazon. That's what we use. And so that's what we're pulling in. And then our other cloud provider, Titus, we're pulling in from source code. But definitely you need Spinnaker core.
Cameron and I were talking, we're going to try, I think maybe like the next couple of days, just to get kind of like a starter template available for folks.
It's a great idea.
He was talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
So hopefully, within the next few days.
Stay tuned.
Yeah, we'll get a little template.
And I think that because of the nature of a lot of these integrations, and especially there's a risk of having like really disparate UX, especially when you're pulling in existing code. I think that if you have questions going forward, reaching out to Chris or myself, we're pretty much out of time, but reaching out to Chris or myself to maybe talk through maybe your use case, I'm happy to definitely field any questions about, hey, I'm trying to build a view to do this thing, but not so much from an implementation standpoint, but from really creating, the benefit is this, the benefit of these integrations is creating a seamless experience. And if I can help with that, sort of talk through anything with you, I'm happy to do so. So feel free to reach out to me. I'm on the Spinnaker Slack channel, Slack group. I believe I'm just Jeremy.
Oh, I think it's something else.
I was in our. I could be Tateltot. I'll have to check on that. It's one of the two. My last name is Tatelman. I should be easy to find. Any other questions before we finish up? Great. Thank you all so much. And feel free to grab us.